My name is Spencer Meyer with the Highstead Foundation, and I'm going to introduce a few people in just a minute. First, I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be available afterwards for your viewing pleasure. Again, I'm Spencer Meyer of the Highstead Foundation, and I want to introduce my good friend and longtime colleague, Leigh Whelpton with the Conservation Finance Network to join me here. Hi, Leigh. Good to see you.
Thanks, Spencer.
Thank you again for joining us today. Leigh and I and Conservation Finance Network and Highstead together are really excited to be launching this 5-part learning lab over the winter with all of you. We've for quite a while now been hearing feedback from many of you through our Conservation Finance Network newsletters and events, and through our Highstead RCP regional gathering and other events, the kinds of information we know many of you have been eager to learn more about and the kind of networking you want to do. And together with our colleagues I'm going to introduce in a minute, we've put this series together. I'm really thrilled to kick it off today with the first part, structuring conservation transactions to broaden partnerships and funding sources. Before I turn it over to Leigh and we really get started, I want to just acknowledge some of our partners in bringing this together. As many of you know, it takes so much energy and effort and expertise to pull off events like this. And I want to just highlight a few people who you may not hear as much from today, but they're every bit important in bringing all this information to you. So on the Highstead team, we have Tara Whalen, Jody Kaloji, Tawasser Vaughn, Fiona Lunt, and Jean Ammermuller, who have been helping us behind the scenes, and you received communications from many of these folks. And then on the CFN team, we also have Helen Rogers and Jackson Moeller, who have helped bring together our speakers for all of our series and been instrumental in planning and designing this course. Leigh, am I forgetting anyone else we should be talking about right now?
Lots more thanks to come throughout the series, but I think you nailed it for today.
Great. Leigh, can I have you introduce our panel for today and tell us about what we have in store and any other opening remarks you want to make, please?
Sure, thanks, Spencer. I'd say we are thrilled to be able to pull together this 5-part series. We hope you'll stick with us throughout the duration, a little monthly gathering, if you will, through April. So please do come back and we'll tell you more about the next sessions. But we're really excited to kick off today. And Leigh, the director of the Conservation Finance Network, our fundamental business is to expand people's capacity, confidence, and connections to execute on conservation finance. Our aim is to really bridge sectors and silos to help people find the capital they need to advance the pace and scale of their own efforts. Spencer beat me to the thanks for my team, but I'll just echo a thanks to the Highstead team and to all of you who are joining us today. I'll share a few of your self-reported reasons for being here. We asked for your frustrations and challenges with finding financial resources to support your work. Unsurprisingly, we heard limited funding streams, lack of funding streams, lack of local match for public funding, lack of community-centered models, and a personal favorite, there ain't enough of it. So what we really hope today is that the series is going to give you practical insight and plenty to follow up on within your organizations, within your collaborations, and within your communities. I'm going to do brief intros to our speakers. Rich Cochran, President and CEO of the Western Reserve Land Conservancy. He was the very first employee of the organization, which now represents the merger of not even 1 or 2 or 3, 13 land conservancies. So theirs is a story of really incredible strategic alignment and growth, something we're going to learn a little bit more about today. And these days, Western Reserve Land Conservancy generates more than $20 million annually, employs 50 people, has preserved 70,000 acres valued at $70 million. They're working to make Cleveland the greenest and healthiest city of America. And as a native Ohioan, I'm very excited to follow their efforts. Isaac Robb, Vice President of Planning and Urban Projects, also with Western Reserve. He has led a dozen property inventory projects throughout Ohio, including working on the first citywide inventory of Cleveland. Most recently, this is a really cool project to highlight. Isaac and the Land Conservancy team successfully completed the Brighton Perk project, which transformed a 25-acre former landfill into a vibrant urban park with multi-purpose trails and habitat restoration. We're also joined by George Dusenbury, Vice President for the Southern Region, celebrating his 5th anniversary with the Trust for Public Land. And before TPL, George served as Commissioner of the Atlanta Parks and Recreation Department, Executive Director of Park Pride, a nonprofit dedicated to building civic and corporate support for Atlanta's parks. And I think we'll all be very humbled to learn this. George, prior to those experiences, served as District Director and on the legislative team for Congressman and Civil Rights Leader John Lewis. Last but certainly not least, we're joined by Wendy Jackson, Consultant and Board Member Extraordinaire. Wendy is retired after 35 years in conservation, most recently Executive Vice President with the Land Trust Alliance, and before that, Executive Director of the Freshwater Land Trust in Alabama. She is currently spending her time sharing expertise through service on boards, speaking engagements, and consulting. So as we talk ourselves in here, why are we kicking off this series about broadened partnerships as opposed to, say, forest carbon offsets? I'd say as we're all learning, most conservation problems are but one aspect of complex, multifaceted issues that require more holistic, better resourced cross-sector collaborations beyond the silos or beyond some of the conventional framing that we're used to. And even within CFN's own strategic direction, I'll just share we are doubling down on this need to increase holistic cross-sector collaboration to really find new ways to borrow innovation and align common interests. We believe non-traditional, more holistic cross-sector, cross-issue partnerships can help conservation organizations better align with community equity and environmental needs, and that by doing so, you not only increase the importance and relevance of your work, doing more to address the pressing land and water and health and access and equity issues our communities are facing, but you also expand the tent of potential funding and financing sources that can support your work. As a community, we need to get a bit more sophisticated in understanding those alignments, especially with entities like water utilities, healthcare providers, educational institutions, transportation departments, insurance providers, all those with the potential for aligned interests. And we need to use that alignment to better invest upstream in parks and green space and housing and healthcare, green infrastructure, and climate resilience. It can take a lot of time working with new funding sources and really expanding the tent. In some cases, we're going to need new frameworks. In some cases, we're going to need new statutes. In some cases, new procedures to support our ability to integrate into new systems and sectors. And just sharing a personal aspiration, I really hope today in this kickoff session will help you pick up the phone, call someone in your operating area that could potentially represent a new ally. Let's see, one quick word of acknowledgement just before we jump in and I hand things over to Rich. Land and resource conservation includes buying and selling land, which draws on historic and present day patterns of land ownership and the accumulation of wealth. As a community, we just want to highlight that we all need to do more to acknowledge how laws, regulations, government programs, enforcement, and policies have been racist and unequal for environmental quality, environmental protection, open space access, and our financial systems and institutions. A lot of what we rely on in the conservation sector, like tax benefits, for example, themselves are not equitable systems. So just starting with that acknowledgement, this is where we are collectively. We hope that conservation finance can offer a set of strategies and approaches, as well as community and collegiality to help address harm and help the benefits of conservation accrue more equitably. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Rich to get us started. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to go right into my remarks, and I'm going to share my screen because I tell our story much better with maps and figures. So if I'm not sharing my screen, let me know, but I think I am. And what I wanted to do to start with is mention the fact that the title includes several important words. Transaction, well, they're all important, but transactions, broadening partnerships, and funding sources. And I think a lot of us who are in the business of preserving land or related to it immediately jump to funding sources. Obviously, that's what you need to get our work done. But I would like to say that the terms transactions and partnerships are really important in this session, and I'll be focusing a lot on why I view those two words as really important and sometimes in conflict with each other. Western Reserve Land Conservancy is, again, the result of 13 mergers. We're relatively unique in that we do traditional natural areas conservation, but we also do very rural, very large-scale agricultural conservation, which is kind of the antithesis of our natural areas work. And then we also do intense urban revitalization that is not just focused on conservation transactions, but is very focused on building community, on reforesting cities, on restoring landscapes, on removing vacant and abandoned structures. So it's much broader than traditional conservation transaction work. Just to give you a scope and scale, we work in all of Northeast Ohio, actually larger area. Cleveland is in the middle here of our service area. Each of these sunbursts represents a completed conservation transaction. So we've completed over 800 projects and preserved about 70,000 acres. And it ranges from very rural stuff like over here in the east part of our service area by the Pennsylvania line, and over here in Erie and Huron County, very rural, very Republican, beautiful landscape, to intense urban areas like Cleveland, very Democratic, very urban. So we have this, and then all the exurbs and suburbs in between. So we have this very diverse region in terms of geography, socioeconomically diverse, in every way diverse. As we mentioned, were the result of mergers. The original big merger was 8 land trusts merged simultaneously in 2006. We've merged 13 total now. At that time, those 8 were all pretty small. The one I worked for was called Chagrin River Land Conservancy. I was the first employee of that organization in 1996. We were up to about 10 employees at the time of the merger. Since the merger, we've grown to about 50 employees, and we have maybe actually 60 every year, including our helpers in the summer. We've really evolved. We like to use this term from nice to have. That photo on the left, those are some of my founding board members. And I think the community at large loved us, but viewed us as a little bit nice to have. We were preserving land where there was already a lot of beautiful land preserved. And now we're viewed really as essential to the region. You can see this picture on the right. We're reforesting the city of Cleveland, completely denuded area that really needs our help. This is kind of what we evolved from. Maybe this picture is familiar to some of you from your fundraising lunches and breakfasts and dinners. But this is how we do events now. This is our Juneteenth celebration from 2021. Very different dynamic, and the organization has evolved to embrace these partnerships. You can see this is a huge partnership between us and organizations that are from the neighborhoods on the east side of Cleveland that are predominantly African American. Here's a restoration we're doing in concert with Juneteenth. Here's a great picture of how we used to use our preserved land to benefit the community. This is a fox hunt in Hunting Valley. And here's a picture of how we're using some of our preserved land now. This is our government relations director, Stephen Perk, teaching a young woman from the east side of Cleveland to fish, the first time she'd ever seen a natural body of water. This was a really neat event. We got the Cleveland police force together with African-American children and adults from the east side of Cleveland. There's historically a lot of tension between those communities. We got them out onto a preserve. We got everybody fishing. This is now part of our relationship building work. One more by way of introduction. This is how we used to depict our mission, no people. And this is really how we depict our mission now. So I bring all these things up because it's not all about transactions. It's really about people and relationships and partnerships, and that leads to the funding. We do a lot of natural areas and biodiversity work. We've created more than 180 public parks and preserves. As I mentioned, we do prime soil work as well. and worked with that rural community very closely. What we really want to talk most about today is our urban work, and Isaac is going to tell you more about some of these projects. I'm going to gloss over them. But we got our start in 2011, basically removing urban blight. Cleveland was devastated by the foreclosure crisis. We had tens of thousands of vacant and abandoned structures that had destroyed many neighborhoods in the city of Cleveland and across Ohio, Michigan, and 18 other states. We've now raised $950 million. You heard that right, $950 million to revitalize cities in Ohio. Most of that money actually went to and is going to the removal of abandoned, vacant, and ownerless homes. Some of it is going to regreening, however. So we believe we should remove the toxicity from these neighborhoods, whatever form it takes, and insert nutrients, whatever form that takes. In our case, removing this and creating a new park or preserve or an urban reforestation or some other kind of restoration. And this is a great example. This is actually in the city of Akron, not Cleveland. We bought this old property, which was completely blighted, not only with vacant structures, but PCB, dioxin, et cetera, concrete pads, vacant homes. And this is what it looks like now. And it really had a transformational effect on that neighborhood. We acquired many new funding sources doing this work. And we also learned that our work could really shift from being nice to have to essential. As I mentioned, we build a lot of platforms and partnerships and relationships. That's the key to our work. Platforms, partnerships, relationships. One of the platforms we built was the Ohio Land Bank Association. First, we created approximately 60 county land banks in Ohio. These are quasi-governmental partners. Through that network of land banks, we're able to have a very powerful lobbying platform, and we've raised that $950 million for urban revitalization. And this is the hallmark of our organization. We've also created the Clean Ohio Coalition, the Cleveland Tree Coalition, the Coalition of Ohio Land Trusts, the Black Environmental Leaders Coalition, et cetera. One of the things I think we ought to talk about today, and our hosts mentioned it in the introduction, is this legacy of racism and oppression and disinvestment and things like redlining, and way before redlining as well. We really have studied the effects of redlining. You see this red area here, that was redlined. And you can see it here on this old historic map from 1940s. This map obviously is a new GIS map. This map up here is the 1940 version, hand drawn. And that redlined area is now known as the Cleveland Crescent. And it's 93+% African American. Those communities have been disinvested in and oppressed for many, many decades and generations now. All of the vacant homes are clustered there. All of the lead poisoning in children is clustered there. Everything bad that you can imagine is clustered there. And our team, under Isaac's leadership, actually, who you'll hear from next, did a study of the Clean Ohio Conservation Fund and how it's distributed in Cuyahoga County, which is where Cleveland is. And we looked at that redlining area, the Cleveland Crescent. Here it is, 93% plus African American. Now go over here and look at how much Clean Ohio funding flowed into those neighborhoods over the last 20 years, by the way, literally since 2020. I'm sorry, since the year 2000, versus the white, almost entirely white outer ring suburbs where more than half of the money, 25+ million, flowed into these historically white communities that are very affluent, wealthy, and where my organization was founded, by the way, over here on the east side. Even within the city, this racial disparity exists. The west side is known as the white west side, has gotten 13 million versus the east side, which has gotten 2.3 million. So these disparities were not a little bit. They were so dramatic that it was breathtaking. And we actually changed the methodology of the Clean Ohio Fund, I'm proud to say. This year will be the first year of that new methodology. And we're lobbying the state to change the laws that govern the Clean Ohio Fund. This project you'll learn about from Isaac. It's called Garden of 11 Angels. First project ever funded in the Cleveland Crescent by the Clean Ohio Fund. This is the site of a former serial killer's home where he killed 11 women. In partnership with the community, we created the Garden of 11 Angels. A lot of people have asked me, why do we do this work? And I think it really comes down to these two concepts and quotes. One is that man, call it people, it's a quote, so I had to use the word that the philosopher used. His name was Rene Dubose. Man shapes himself through decisions that shape his environment, which is a very wise and complex set of words. What it really means is that human beings alone are able to shape our environments in very sophisticated ways, like air conditioning and buildings and stuff like that, and cities and roads and sewers, etc. But once we shape those environments shape us the way that they shape all living things. And what that really means is that at the end of the day, in the absence of relative environmental equity, we'll never have human equality. It even affects things like IQ scores. And I'm going to fly through this last few slides because I'm running out of time, but this is a stunning study out of Belgium that shows that for every 3% increase in daily exposure to green space, children's IQ scores increased by 2.8 IQ points for every 3% increase. In the city of Cleveland, we've lost our canopy. You can see it goes from gray to green right on the suburban municipal line. Here's the city of Cleveland. Here's Leafy Shaker Heights. Literally goes from gray to green. We have established a major urban reforestation program. It's going to raise hundreds of millions of dollars. It's already raised tens of millions of new dollars. And that's through, again, a platform, relationships, not through transactions at first, but rather through relationships and platforms. And I'll finish by saying, when you go into this kind of work, it has to be reciprocal. It has to be authentic. It has to be based in relationships and not transactional, because ultimately this is forever work. And it doesn't matter if you're working on the east side of Cleveland with African-American populations or on the far east side in Trump country where we do our farmland work. What really matters is that you're doing it under that partnership model, relationship-based, authentically connected to that community. And what's going to end up happening is you're going to transform your funding portfolio. And I'll just conclude by saying, we really as conservationists owe this to our nation. The secret of all of our futures is hidden in our daily routine. And far too often, this has been the daily routine of young white children, and this has been the daily routine of young non-white children. And we need to change that in our country. And I believe that locally governed conservation organizations like all of yours are the way to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. And now we're going to segue into Isaac to talk a little bit about how Western Reserve really put the platform and those partnerships to use in effect. Take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Can everyone see my screen? Great. So as mentioned, my name is Isaac Roth, and I have the privilege of working with Western Reserve Land Conservancy as part of our Thriving Communities program, which is the urban program that Rich mentioned. For 10 years, our urban program has specifically focused on improving the environmental conditions of the people of Northeast Ohio, especially in the Cleveland area, again, that Rich highlighted. At times, this has led to difficult conversations both within our organization as well as outside, surrounding those, what I like to call those wicked W questions. So why is a predominantly white organization doing this type of work? Where should you be focusing these resources? For whom will these benefits be distributed? Who pays? And what can we bring as a traditional conservation organization that other local partners like community development corporations might not have the expertise in? So being an organization that also starts with a W, we continue to answer these questions through a variety of partner project types and funding sources that has led to what we like to call our definition of urban conservation, which is to build community with land as our medium. So today I will describe not only the what, but in my mind, as Leigh said, the really critical important substance of the how. So as Rich mentioned, we really started off through this network of county land banks. And for those of you that aren't familiar, county land banks are an incredible tool. If your state or county or municipality does not have these, I highly encourage you to look into them. What they essentially allow to do through the Ohio code is to take vacant abandoned properties that are tax delinquent, take them into quasi-public ownership, clear title, and then dispose of the land to public benefit with, it could be to private users or also nonprofits, things like that. As Rich mentioned, that $950 million, that came from some really creative funding sources through the Moving Ohio Forward, which was the former robo-signing settlement out of the foreclosure crisis, to a state brownfield fund, to a troubled asset relief program at the federal level. There's a county demo bond, as well as local financing through tax delinquent financing, the DTAC funds at the local level. So again, I won't go into those details, but my contact information will be shared. If you have any further questions, I'd be happy to answer those later. Also mentioned was sort of the property inventory. So in order to create those partnerships that Rich really highlighted, and to create a narrative that would excite and catalyze a purple state like Ohio to movement, is you have to have good data on that. And so we created these property inventory programs where we would go out and actually inventory every parcel in a city that we work in. The biggest one being City of Cleveland, which is over 158,000 parcels. So when a state representative or a US senator asks, well, okay, we understand that vacant abandonment is an issue, but how much money do you need? But we have real empirical evidence that can be shared and validated to those partners to, again, build a coalition that has mutually beneficial outcomes. But unfortunately, what we've dealt with as a sort of shrinking legacy city is dispersed vacancy and abandonment. This is the Huff neighborhood, one of those East Side neighborhoods that Rich mentioned. And for those of you on the call that aren't from sort of the industrial Midwest or cities, sister cities like ours, we are dealing with a real crisis in vacant land that are not paying taxes, that are now publicly owned through that land bank process. And how can we take those and create something that is sort of a drag on the community and turn it into a community asset? So one of the projects I'd like to mention that Leigh kicked off my introductions is the Brighton Perk project. This is a landfill to landmark. My former supervisor, Jim Rakakis, is a proud Greek American, and he always liked to refer to the funding needed for this as sort of the baklava of funding. And so you really have to have some real passionate and sort of a narrative to each of these projects. So this project, the narrative really was around restoration, taking something that was contaminated and forgotten and turning it into an asset. So we've received federal funds through the Recreational Trails Program, Sustain Our Great Lakes, county funds for the remediation. So again, it's really piecing things together. Once you hit that sort of tipping point, the money comes into place and it's really able to turn into something fantastic that you can see in these slides. The other project I'd like to mention is the Ubuntu Gathering Place. What's interesting about this is working in partnership with the East End Neighborhood House, which is a former settlement house, current settlement house, I should say, but former in the sense of sort of the Jane Addams era, similar to Hull House. But originally this neighborhood was predominantly Hungarian and Eastern European, and today it's over 90, maybe 95% African American. And so this site is a former Saab dealership that we're turning into sort of a gathering place because there was no outdoor gathering place for these social programs for young people and seniors, really being led by the East End Neighborhood House. They were able to acquire some really key initial private funding, and then we were able to tap into some of the more traditional conservation funding sources that we are familiar with, a green infrastructure grant, a Partners for Places grant, things like that to bring the finance stack together. We are proud to say that we've completed phase one, again, really paying homage to the neighborhood and the continent of Africa. Phase two will be completed in next year. Rich also mentioned the Garden of 11 Angels project. Again, this is something that is really tough to wrap your mind around just from how tragic this project was and the events that took place there. We really view this more as a community healing project. So we took 8 vacant parcels, and again, using a community-centered design process, specifically with the families of the surviving family members of the victims, created something that not only provides a space of healing and reflection for the family members, but also the community as well that experienced significant trauma. And we were really proud of our work leading that. The Land Conservancy actually owns these 8 parcels and will in perpetuity. but we've partnered with a local community development corporation. It's not enough to just say we partnered. We've actually created a maintenance endowment to work with them to use their minority-owned business and landscaping contractor team to go out and provide maintenance on the site that we own. So it wasn't enough to just build it. We also needed to fundraise for the maintenance endowment on this. And again, as you can imagine, it just took a lot of funding sources. It took far too long. But what we're really proud is that Clean Ohio Fund that Rich mentioned, this was the first project that the Clean Ohio Fund funded in a formerly redlined neighborhood on the east side of Cleveland. And the interesting thing is usually the acquisition of those projects, most of the money goes to the acquisition of the land, and maybe a nominal amount will go to the actual improvements on the site. But because of the low value real estate here, we only spent $1,800 to acquire all 8 of those properties, but we raised $140,000 for those improvements that you can see through the infinity symbol and the monument and gathering place for the Garden of 11 Angels. And the last project I want to reference, we just closed on this acquisition earlier this month. This is the Euclid Beach project, and what's interesting here, this is a 28.5 acre parcel right on the shores of Lake Erie that, as you can see, is surrounded by existing public green space. But we were able to get acquisition financing through the Greater Cleveland Partnership, which is essentially the Chamber of Commerce for Greater Cleveland. And so the private business community saw the potential for this project and what it could mean for a unified, publicly accessible place on the lake in the east side of Cleveland, and were able to give us below market financing for the acquisition of this as well. And so, in conclusion, as Rich mentioned, the partnerships really drive the financing for these. We go out, we get invited in to work on these projects because of our deep relationships within the community. And from those relationships, we get invited to do other projects. And once you show a strong coalition of partners, it opens up different types of funding sources than what we're usually familiar with applying for or working with. And also, it allows us to partner with people like community development corporations that might be eligible for funding that we normally don't go after or we're not eligible to. So again, thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions towards the end of our time together.
Thanks, Isaac. And I think we'll take some of the inspiration from the way that Western Reserve has really put the platform and partnerships to effect for unconventional funding, for unconventional outcomes. We'll shift now from Ohio down to Metro Atlanta. And George, if you could jump in and tell us a bit about the Perk project.
Sure. There you go. I had to unmute myself. It's not a Zoom meeting if somebody doesn't forget to unmute themselves. So my name is George Dusenbury. I'm the Vice President for the Southeast for the Trust for Public Land. For those who don't know, we're a national organization. We'll be celebrating our 50th anniversary next year. And we were founded by some former Nature Conservancy staffers who wanted to preserve some land out west. It really had not much ecological value, but really the people who lived near it wanted to preserve it and use it for public, for people. And that really is kind of a distinguishing factor for the Trust for Land, is that when we preserve land for people to use. It's not necessarily for conservation, although conservation benefits are very important. And that permeates our work. So community is the center of everything we do. And for that reason, we've actually been more active in the urban space for longer than a lot of national conservation organizations. We've had a Georgia office for 30 years, but goodness, we were involved in the late 70s, early 80s in working with the National Park Service here to acquire land to create the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Park. Similarly, we've had a lot of urban work in New York City and across the country, really kind of focusing on that space, focusing on community. Isaac had mentioned how oftentimes Western Reserve Land Trust looks for communities to invite them in. We also will go and seek out communities with whom we'd like to work. And we do that through the lens of health, equity, and climate. And I'll talk later about some of the tools that the Trust for Land uses to identify which communities we want to work with. But I will reiterate that ultimately success is working with community, it's working with people. I had a board member who said we just build parks, and I corrected him, and I think I'm paraphrasing Isaac here a little bit and say we build community by using parks to solve problems and improve quality of life. Ultimately, seeing this as a very valuable tool to impact people. Being around for 50 years, we've had a lot of impact across the country. You know, I'll just kind of let those figures speak for themselves. But we continue to do this work. We have 30 offices around the country, including one in Cleveland. My colleague Sean Terry is the state director there. And I do not know if he worked with us, so I probably should have known that before mentioning it. I'm here today to talk about a project called Cook Park. It's on Atlanta's west side, and it's recently completed a green infrastructure park that the Trust Fund worked with the city to help build. So this is Cook Park. At least it was 20 years ago. There were 60 families living on about 16 acres in Vine City, which is an historic African-American city on the west side, community on the west side of Atlanta. In fact, Dr. King raised his family about a block west of Cook Park. And what's important to say here, the dynamics in Atlanta are different than the dynamics in Cleveland, in that as we started to approach this project, land is in demand in Atlanta, and there's concerns about green gentrification and displacement. So when the city came to us, they said, hey, we want to work with you. We want to work with the community, and we want to design and try to build this park. And this is what we were brought in about 6 years ago to do, was to help design and raise the money to make it happen. Displacement was really a key concern, particularly working in such an important historic Black community in Atlanta. And we were fortunate in doing this that we had a lot of great partners, one of whom is the West Side Future Fund, who holistically was working, this is the Vine City community, across the street to the left here, looking at your screen, actually is the English Avenue community, that was working to make sure that we were retaining residents. So they actually developed programs to keep homeowners in their homes, but also to acquire apartment buildings, renovate them, keep rents low, so that when people saw a wonderful park like this, they wanted to live near it. And you see how close we are to downtown Atlanta and be part of it. The folks who lived in the community, the folks who are the reason why we and other folks were investing in the community were able to stay there and enjoy it. And so working with the city, we were able to raise $44 million of public and private funds. That's about $14 million in private funds, more than $30 million in public funds to make Cook Park open. And we cut the ribbon on it this year, July. And here you see kind of a prequel, and here's some of my favorite pictures of the park, where you kind of get a sense of it. In building that, I mentioned philanthropically cobbled together $14 million from private funders. Our main partner on this was the Department of Watershed Management. As you could well see from the initial images, this community was prone to flooding. You had a lot of development downtown, impervious surfaces. You had a 100-year-old combined sewer system. And what that means with combined sewers is that it would put the sanitary sewer and the stormwater sewer into the same pipe. And that worked when they built it, when there was less sewer and when there was less impervious surface. Unfortunately, after 100 years, the infrastructure could not keep up. And when you have like thunderstorms and high rain events, which are very frequent here in the Southeast, they would flood and spilling not just water, but sewage into the community. So the images I showed you earlier, that was not clean stormwater. That was actually a combination of sewage and stormwater that displaced those 60 families relocated by the city of Atlanta. Another way we brought public funding together actually was through the Development Authority. We call it Invest Atlanta here in Atlanta. And they put more than $2 million into the renovation and construction of this park, largely because in addition to being flood prone, this site was a brownfield site. And the city ended up spending about $6 million remediating some pretty serious contamination in the soil that permeated the entire site. When you looked at the public funding, those were the two big sources. And the lesson that I want to take out of this is because this park not only serves a recreational amenity, but because it eliminates flooding in 150 acres around the park, we actually found that the Department of Watershed Management was really a key partner for us in terms of finding the money to make this happen. This is the image here on the right that comes from our Metropolitan Planning Organization, the Atlanta Regional Commission. And I highlight this, and again, this is probably a common theme you'll hear, is that parks aren't nice to have, they are essential. They are essential infrastructure. And when you are looking at what parks and green space do for communities, they are world-class infrastructure. They do help you compete economically to attract residents, to attract businesses by improving quality of life. And then also they help create livable, healthy communities by helping to mitigate the impacts of climate change in terms of heat island effect, reducing vulnerability to flooding, but also cleaning the air, providing opportunities for outdoor recreation. There's a distinct health benefit to everything we do. And because there are all these benefits from parks and green space, there are all these departments, all these agencies that actually have a vested interest in our work. And I've listed some of them here, but with Cook Park, Watershed provided funds to help build it. Public Works and Transportation provided funds to help build it. School districts, and they were not involved with Cook Park, but I do want to highlight them because in most communities, school districts are oftentimes have their own taxing authority. They have significant funding streams, and they oftentimes are the largest landowner in cities. And so if you're looking in terms of green space, collaboration and cooperation with school districts is a really great way to do that. Nationally, the Trust Public Land has a community schoolyard program where we partner with school districts, we partner with municipalities and other nonprofits so that we redesign and reimagine these schoolyards so they better serve students during the day, enhancing educational outcomes, but also improving health, improving environment. And then they're open to the community in the evening. So again, providing access to these benefits that parks and green space have. Do not overlook school districts when you're looking at your work in urban areas. I forgot to mention workforce development when I was talking about Cook Park, but a key element of this was working with a local work development authority here in Atlanta so that people from the community were given construction jobs when we were building Cook Park. There was training to support them, there were employment opportunities afterward, and particularly in today's economy with such a shortage of workers, leveraging any kind of park construction project to provide job training provides a ladder up for the folks who live in the communities with whom we're working. So again, money can be there, but more importantly, you're positively impacting the community. And if you are in that community and you help build that park, it provides this tremendous sense of ownership, which benefits the park and the community moving forward. Offices of Sustainability and Resilience, particularly when you are doing work to address the impacts of climate change. I mentioned Development Authority. Planning departments oftentimes have excess land. They can provide funding to help do planning studies that help us do our work in terms of where we want to do our work, particularly when you're bringing the trail component of this, and that's going to play into the federal funding aspect of it. And then the metropolitan planning organizations also similarly have money for those areas. So when you're looking, again, cast a wide net because of all the positive impacts that parks and green spaces have in communities. That opens up all of these different types of partners who can bring resources, both financial and otherwise, to the table to help you make things happen. We also actually work with housing authorities in terms of integrating parks and green space with affordable housing in Metro Atlanta. I want to highlight the water department. In the city of Atlanta, the city has about a $1.5 billion overall budget. 500 million of that is the airport. 500 million of that is the city itself. This is general fund budget. And 500 million is the water department. There's a lot of money in water. And similarly, if you look at a lot of the federal funding that's coming through with the American Recovery Act funding, stormwater was one of those areas where you could spend money. So there's this tremendous opportunity to take federal funds and use them, leverage them in terms of green space acquisition and the development of parks if there's a green infrastructure component to address stormwater and flooding. Many municipal water utilities also have their own revenue just basically from the customer base. A lot of agencies also have stormwater fees, basically looking at impervious surface and then charging for that. And then they're able to use those funds, not just for building pipes, but also for acquiring land, for building stormwater facilities, that beautiful pond you saw in Cook Park is actually a stormwater facility. And so those are tremendous opportunities for you in terms of partnering in your work. And then lastly, the Federal Emergency Management Administration actually has funds to acquire property in floodplain areas, flood-prone areas, demolish any housing or impervious surface on there and use them as green space. You really can't use heavy development for parks, but again, your water department may be your better bet, not your parks department, in terms of looking for a municipal partner for work on a large scale in urban environment. I did want to highlight here in the city of Atlanta, actually, we had a unique situation where the water department was sued, the city was sued because of its stormwater pollution negatively impacting the Chattahoochee River, which you see kind of moving diagonally from the upper right-hand portion of that picture in the screen to the lower left-hand picture. And they had to set aside money to help mitigate that impact, including $25 million to acquire streamside properties, not only in the city of Atlanta, but across the region. So again, there are a lot of cities around the country that are under consent decree because, not just cities, counties, that are under consent decrees because they've not adequately addressed their stormwater because it's been negligent for 100 years. They may have committed bonding money, may have committed sales tax money, but similarly, they may be redirecting American Recovery Act money to address the stormwater, which makes them really great partners in terms of our work in using parks to help solve these problems. Again, using parks, using green space to solve problems is really opens up those collaborations, opens the doors to a lot of different folks who we think of as non-traditional funding partners, and allows us to collaborate, bring private philanthropy to make these parks and public spaces work.
George, you've got 1 minute here.
Okay, well, this is my last slide. This is great. So just TPL's got some great resources, and if you put this in the chat, ParkServe is a free online GIS tool you can use to look at your facility to see where areas most need parks. We also have a conservation finance team that can work with you in terms of finding the funds, how to leverage them at the local or the state level. And then we have some other research and innovation team, fee for service, that can work with you to drive a little deeper. I know we did a lot of that in Cleveland in terms of our Climate Smart Cities tool. And there we go. Look at that. My timing was pretty good. Thanks, Leigh.
Thanks, George. I really like the vignette you opened with about your board member saying you create parks, and the kind of retort that parks are not an end unto themselves, but a means to an end for infrastructure, for community building, for livability, for economic development. And something we didn't get into, but important to highlight, just the importance of ballot and bond measures to create new funding sources. You flashed on your slide overview of TPL playing a really integral role in the creation of $60 billion with a B dollars for land and resource conservation. And I think that goes under acknowledged sometimes, especially in a conservation finance circuit, with some of the sexiness, if you will, with private sector partnerships and impact investing. But that is such a significantly larger source of funding that's being created at the community level for the type of work that we're all doing, that we really, we kind of chase the impact investing unicorns at our peril sometimes. I will say that is one reason why we wanted to start with this particular session. Also a reason that CFN in our mission statement has the word effective funding alongside innovative financing as part of our mission. So we can get into a whole lot more of that in the panel discussion. But first, we need to travel to Birmingham, Alabama, and over to you, Wendy, to really continue this exploration of what green space and parks do for communities. So I'll hand it over to you. And you were on mute, Wendy.
Can you hear me now?
We've got you.
Okay. First thing I want to say is that the worst time to get the blue screen of death on your computer is 2 weeks before Christmas in the middle of a transportation nightmare. I apologize for not having a PowerPoint presentation, so you just get to enjoy, my friendly face. And because my computer just came in, my new computer just got here last night. So I apologize, but just imagine a lot of very similar pictures that you saw in the other presentations. But I do want to speak a little bit to, I know when you hear the end, where somebody has been after they've traveled 15 years down this path, the numbers seem huge, and all of that. And I just want to speak a little bit about, what it's like when you first start out. Okay, because when I started my career for Freshwater Land Trust, I was fresh off about 8 years at the Nature Conservancy. And I was asked to start this new land trust in Birmingham, and it was focused on preserving freshwater biodiversity. And, of course, I came with all of the science from the Nature Conservancy. I love the organization, they're a household name and all of that. But largely the work I was doing in Alabama at the Nature Conservancy was in the rural areas. And at the Freshwater Land Trust, I was going to be working in both urban and rural. And I can just tell you, as I started going and doing presentations and talking about Alabama's #1 in freshwater biodiversity, and it is very important for us to protect the rivers and streams and the riparian buffer zones, I very quickly realized I was getting nowhere fast, okay? And we really needed to make up ground. I was the founding ED. I opened the checking account with $25 of my own money. And the message that we had was just not working. And so I had to step back. And it is at that point I began to realize that conservation is not about getting people to buy into your vision. It's about you buying into their vision. And as I was doing small presentations, I was listening to the feedback that I was receiving. And people would come up and say, we have some of the worst outcomes and health outcomes in the country. We don't have time to worry about a fish. We're worried about jobs. We're worried about safety and crime and all of these other issues. So we realized that we needed to change the way we spoke about conservation. And that was, and in my presentation that I usually do, I actually show you the slides we started out with. They're very cheesy. They were not very well done, but they are a reminder of we were a new nonprofit with very limited resources. And I was just scouring information. Health was the #1 issue in our community. And so we began talking about conservation in the terms of how it can benefit health. And back in those days, we didn't have all of the data we have now. A lot of people can be credited, Trust for Public Land, the conservation finance community, for collecting up a lot of data that's readily available, but that was not back in the day, when we first started. And so, but as we started talking about conservation in terms of health outcomes and the contributions that natural areas can contribute to, physical activity, mental health, and the economic benefits of conservation, people began to sit up and take notice. And one of the people who really started to take notice was the head of the local community foundation, Kate Nielsen at the time. And she came up to me and she said, "Have you met the health department director?" And I said, "No." "Why?" And she said, "Well, you should, because you're going around saying exactly what he's saying about physical activity and health outcomes in the outdoors." And so I did go and meet with Dr. Fleener at the time of the Jefferson County Health Department. And he told me, he said, "I sit in the shadow of one of the greatest health institutions in the country, University of Alabama, Birmingham, and I have some of the worst health outcomes. We have to quit focusing on treatment and start focusing on prevention." He was a leader because back in the day, prevention was not a huge part of the conversation. And so he asked me if we thought we could, pull off some physical activity through green spaces. And of course I was like, "Oh, sure, we can do that." Ignorance is also very bliss. If you believe you can do it, sometimes you can do it, And, but I went to my good friend, Bruz Clark in Chattanooga. And this is a lot of credit to Trust for Public Land. They were the leaders there working with the Lyndhurst Foundation. But Bruz took us, we all went riding bicycles through Chattanooga. The health department director came back and said, can we do that in Birmingham? And again, I'm like, sure, we can do that. And we were added to the Health Action Partnership, which was a coalition of about 30 organizations focused on improving health outcomes for the community. And as a member of the Health Action Partnership, we were a part of the Built Environment Committee, and we were part of an application for a national grant that gave us $300,000 to plan a trail system for all of Jefferson County. That grant funded not only the plan, it funded stakeholder engagement, and it set us on the path of going from an unknown little nonprofit to an essential part of the community. Thank you, Rich, for that word, to a household name. And so we launched the planning effort for the Red Rock Trail System, and we had thousands of people participate in that planning process and thousands of people to show up for the unveiling. We said we would do 20 stakeholder meetings. We ended up doing 45. We met with everybody from the CEOs to community leaders, faith-based, health educators, environmentalists, farmers, anybody. And we asked them, where is your 1 mile and what does it connect you to? And what should we keep in mind as we do this trail system? And it was unbelievable what happened afterwards. When you went through that process and we unveiled the planning system, Alta Planning and Design was on the team, and they worked nationally on these type of trail systems. And they said it was the most diverse and largest coalition of people to show up for a trail plan unveiling that they had ever encountered. And we've all of a sudden had buy-in from everyone. But this is critically important. When people share their voices with you, you have to honor those voices and don't just get their advice and then never go back. You have to maintain those relationships. And that's exactly what we did, because some of the voices that we heard were, I hope when you get this trail plan finished, you don't forget about the people where the greatest health disparities are. And we remembered those conversations, and we went after a $16 million Tiger grant. And Secretary Ray LaHood, who was head of transportation, would later tell me that our Tiger grant application has, and I was recently told, still has the largest coalition and diverse coalition of partners ever in the history of the Tiger grant program. But that 26 miles that was funded through that $16 million Tiger grant went to the communities with the greatest health disparities. And we had some people that were very nervous about, can you really put parks and trails in these underserved communities? Will it be safe? Will it be this? The trails were a smashing success, and it has made a huge difference. And that would springboard us into projects, everything from brownfield revitalization to stream bed restoration, mitigation, corporate partnerships. And I think in the interest of time, just to give you a sense of the awards that were won by projects that are now on the ground by the Freshwater Land Trust, NAAC Torchbearer Award, EPA Phoenix Brownfield, successful revitalization, the first time in the history of that program that Green Space had won, a complete green space project had won a brownfield program. American Planning Association Health Partner of the Year, Corporate Partner of the Year, Riverkeeper, Nonprofit Conservation Organization of the Year, the Birmingham Business Council Nonprofit Chamber of the Year, American Bar Association Environmental Leader. The list just goes on and on and on, that we were recognized in the community. And it has been such a game changer for the Birmingham region. After 15 years, I went to Washington, D.C. to be the executive vice president of the Freshwater Land Trust. But the work has continued, and I have continued to be involved since my retirement, have come back, and it has now moved beyond the city of Birmingham. It is statewide. Several years back, the city of Birmingham, when the parks and the trails and the revitalization started occurring in Birmingham, the city of Birmingham said they wanted to go after the World Games for 2022. the governor of the state of Alabama threw out this astronomical number. All of us were shocked that they would pledge if Birmingham got the World Games. And when it was announced that the World Games were coming to Birmingham in 2022, the governor's director of communication must not have been around that day, because he actually made the comment when somebody said, wow, you're going to have to pony up all that money. You know, that's a huge amount. And he's like, yeah, I didn't think they would get it. You know, we didn't think they'd get the games. And that moment was a sea change for what is Birmingham doing? And now what can the state of Alabama do to kind of mirror what is happening in Birmingham? And so now we have an Alabama Trails Commission, and I am serving on the Alabama Trails Foundation. And it is the power of being able to talk about the health benefits of conservation, the economic benefits of conservation, the job.
Did Wendy freeze for just a minute here?
She's
Well,
frozen
she
on
was-
my screen, Leigh.
She was just bringing the house down too. So hopefully if the Highstead team can help us get Wendy back on so she can add her own exclamation part to her remarks. But in the interim, I think I'll invite the rest of the panel on and we can kick off our discussion there. All right. So as we're waiting for Wendy, I'll start with a little bit of a softball here in the discussion. And partly, we want to give folks an ability to enter their questions into the chat. Please do so, and we'll feed those through as we have about 25 minutes left together. So let's kick things off. First of all, just really incredibly inspiring work. I think it's no surprise to the audience. We really wanted to highlight exactly this type of example so as to spark and inspire people to think a little bit more broadly, not just about transactions, as you say, but also about the underlying support and strategy for relevance and for engagement in your community and what conservation actually means to whom. So we have tried across these presentations to emphasize both inequities and opportunities that come from becoming more relevant. As you say, becoming not nice to have, but essential. And I'd love to just kick off with how you talk about that commonality and some of the messaging around it, whether inside your own organization, which may be an appropriate starting point. Rich, I might ask you to comment the extent to which internal organizational change needs to preclude some broader, not preclude, go ahead of some broader community engagement, but also how you actually take that messaging to partners and to constituencies.
Yeah, thank you. That's maybe the single most important question I've been asked in a long time. I think, we view everything through the lens of everything is a process, not an event. And to the degree that we've gone through internal change processes, which is a lot, 13 mergers, going from an ex-urban all-white land trust to a rural as well, then going into the inner city and really diversifying racially and economically as well. I would say I view all of this work, if I had viewed it as an event, as the merger as an event, for example, or the urban work as an event that we just all of a sudden turn that switch on, we really wouldn't be talking about it right now because it wouldn't have worked. It was a long process, many years actually, to get here and to even get to the initial success point. And then the second concept I would add, because every organization is different as to how long that process takes and how long it takes and what it looks like. But I would say the common denominator of all of these change processes is this: you have to learn how to dose the messaging so that you don't kill the person you're communicating with the dosage. So it's not all at once. We can overwhelm the system if we just walk in and say, we're going to change overnight, and all of a sudden we're going to be working in on the east side of Cleveland. That's just not going to happen. We have to dose our audiences correctly. So that's the system that's worked for us. Whenever we haven't done it, it's backfired.
So we have getting the correct dosage of the message, which maybe trades nicely with TPL's Perk prescription program. George, I might punt over to you to talk similarly about how you really craft some of the messaging, how you really, whether that's internal or community facing. You're on mute, George.
There we go. I managed to double mute myself. So I think what's important is telling our story through the people that we impact. And that is something that Trust Public Land is very intentional about. Example would be when we talk a lot about Cook Park, we talk about a woman named Cheryl Hood, who was flooded out from the community. And basically her 2 grandchildren helped her swim to safety on the night. And we were able to bring her back to the park 19 years later and to see what it had done and how we were positively impacting her life. So I think that's a part of it. And then the other spectrum is we're a big believer in data at the Trust for Public Land. I mentioned we have a Climate Smart Cities program, which you can overlay layers of health, you can overlay layers of equity and climate. I believe Isaac used some of that tool in around Cleveland. And so telling that story, because I thought actually that Rich did a really good job talking about the historic impact of redlining and just using the data and putting it out there and not being judgmental. I think Rich did also a good job of saying we have to level set from where we are. We can't level set, we're not living 30 years ago. We were living with the decisions that a lot of folks made before us. So I think that's part of it is combining the data along with the human, because people respond to the emotional and the human, but you can use the data to back that up and show the systemic challenge, but also the systemic solution for those challenges.
And obviously, and this has already come up in the chat as a question, in this type of, especially urban, especially equity-centered, especially urban green space creation, you have to encounter at some point the issue of gentrification. And so I wonder if whoever wants to kick us off here, if we could kind of get into a bit of how in this work you can help to prevent against the very people you're trying to uplift and support being displaced from their own neighborhoods.
Leigh, before we do that, I just want to jump in and say Wendy is back online with us via phone, and someone needs to make her co-host. I'm not able to do that, and then we can get her to join us again.
I'll jump in.
Glad to have you back, Wendy.
Yeah, I can jump in.
Sorry about that. Power just completely disappeared and I don't know what happened. So I apologize.
So, gentrification happens because the work we do is good. If you look at how you want to revitalize community, and you saw some of those pictures I showed of the flooding of Vine City, that Isaac and Rich showed of areas of Cleveland, there are areas that are in vital need of revitalization. And everybody wants to live in a safe community. Everybody wants to live in a community where there are good schools and where there are good public spaces. I often say if you want to revitalize a community, it's about public safety, public schools, and public spaces. But when you do that, you are going to likely, when the community is revitalized, property values can go up, it becomes more expensive to live in the displacement. I don't think gentrification is a bad word, it's displacement. It's, if you live next to an abandoned house and a upper middle class affluent person moves into that house and starts mowing it and fixes it up, that's a great thing. When it becomes a problem is, well, your property values go up, you can no longer afford to live next to that home. And so it's important to get into the community early and have these conversations, to engage those agencies in housing and planning early on and have a plan so you're trying to mitigate and work with it. I think that is what's important. So your conversation really needs to be holistic. It's not about our project, it's about the community, and it's about how we can work with that community on this project in such a way that we're also ensuring that they're there to enjoy it. And I think that's a key. And I really do emphasize gentrification is not a bad thing. Displacement is a bad thing.
Well, and George, can you say a little bit more in the Vine City example of the partnerships and the funding sources that came in to acquire housing as a way to maintain rent stability?
Yeah, so that is interesting, and that is a challenge. So Vine City in the 1960s, early 1970s, there were 40,000 people living in Vine City and English Avenue communities. When we started our work, there were 10,000 people living in those communities. There was an organization called the West Side Future Fund. It was a nonprofit that was founded basically to kind of be the quarterback for all the nonprofits coming in these communities and trying to help. And they tackled that head on. And what they said is, our job is to get us back to 40,000 people living in Vine City and English Avenue while keeping the 10,000 that are currently living here. And they were able to raise a lot of public funds and private funds because the mayor of the state of Atlanta made it a priority. The business community rallied behind it, and they raised, goodness gracious, probably like $50 or $60 million, if not more, to acquire and rehabilitate properties. And then there are federal programs that you should work with your housing authority on this and your development authorities in terms of renovating housing for low income. They did that, and then they basically were able to offer affordable housing for folks in these apartments. And I would emphasize that in poor communities, that is a change in that a lot of those apartments and rental properties are churning. And they were actually looking to create stability in a place where churn existed. So it really was an impressive feat on their part to go in there and work with the residents to actually provide some social services to allow them to stay. A second thing they did, which I thought was really unique, is for property owners could enroll in this program. And let's say you were paying, $1,000 a month in property taxes. You enroll in this program, and if because of all the investments in the community, your property taxes go to $2,000 a year, this program would pay that $1,000 differential, and it would put a lien on your house. So you were able to stay in that house, and you were able to get the equity, because these houses were selling for like $10,000, $15,000. They're already at $300,000. So you would get that increase in equity, and you would not be displaced out of your property. And when you did sell, that money would go back into the program so that somebody else could get that relief too. So I just encourage people to look at the West Side Future Fund here in Atlanta, Georgia, in terms of their apartment rehabilitation, which I cannot emphasize, there was significant public and private investment in there. And you need that kind of political will to make it happen. But if you do have that political will, you can get ahead of the game, and you can actually positively impact or positively fight back against the pressures of displacement.
Thanks, George. And though we don't have Wendy pinned, she is still part of the discussion. So Wendy, by all means, call yourself into the discussion here. I wonder whether for Birmingham or for Cleveland, how the issue of displacement was encountered, whether in a specific project or kind of overall as an organizational approach.
In one of the communities in Birmingham, Alabama, it was very similar to what he talked about in Atlanta. There were financial resources that were set aside to help stabilize the people who had been there for a very long time. And we also had a situation where there were apartments, and these apartments were not the former owners of those apartments were not necessarily a friend to the community, more basically taking advantage of the community. And I think the long story short, with trying to work in a neighborhood and being aware of gentrification, displacement, whatever word you want to use, is to be side by side with your community leaders and follow their lead. Our experience is there's not a one size fits all. There's no magic wand. Every community is different, but the community itself oftentimes can lead you to a way to address those issues. And that is exactly what happened in Norwood with a community leader who worked with us. They did want to see those apartments turned over, and but in the replacement of those. We were able to step in and acquire some of that property, but in that removing those former owners, we were able to put affordable housing in the mix. And that is something of major consideration, is being able to keep the people who want to stay in the community and make it cost effective for them to do so, while at the same time providing them social and community services that they can access. And we did all of that in partnership with the president of the neighborhood association for that neighborhood.
Thanks, Wendy. And Isaac, I know you added a bit of nuance about the specifics of Cleveland in response in the chat, but maybe I'll just call on you to share a quick word there before we move on.
Yeah, and I think, Cleveland, it's, depending on the year, it's either the most impoverished large city in America or the second. So again, our issue really is around concentrated poverty. And I think, you can address that in a variety of ways. We just think that there needs to be more of those places that George mentioned, more healthy, safe places for opportunity. And with all the vacant land that was referenced, we are really encouraging and trying to work with folks to increase ownership. Because again, this is America, right? If you don't own the land, your rights are much more limited. And so we're interested in increasing that ownership within these communities, but also stopping the depopulation. The most recent census, the east side of Cleveland is still losing people based on those issues of poverty, violence, and lack of opportunities in good schools. I think close to 70% of Cleveland adults are functionally illiterate. So again, our issues are much greater and more systemic than displacement around green space.
All right, I'd love to shift a little bit into a focus on the money side. We've talked about the importance of equity, community engagement, broader tent partnerships, more holistic system level projects and efforts. Where does that lead us on money? I love the reference to layers of baklava, and I'm now in my mind envisioning some kind of a 30 plus layer piece of baklava that really cobbles together all the different sources of funding, financing, and in kind. And I think perhaps I'm even guilty of this. A lot of us get excited about the tools and strategies under the umbrella of conservation finance because we see the potential for some kind of a silver bullet. And I think the beauty of shifting from a nice to have to an essential organization, mission, and service to your community is that you effectively stumble into as close as we probably can get to silver buckshot. So that's my rambly lead in to just dig in a bit deeper on some of the more unconventional sources of funding or financing. We've had a couple of these hinted at in the presentations, but just to give a little more emphasis to where those funds have come from that conservationists to date have really not tapped into.
Who do you want to go first?
I was leaving it to volunteerism, but Rich, you're off mute, so I'll nominate.
Yeah, I mean, I think you summarized it really well. What we found is that there are a few traditional conservation funding sources that we can continue to use in these different environments and different communities, but there's a whole world of new ones. I mean, I never even really knew what the hardest hit fund was. And then all of a sudden we were reprogramming $2.2 billion of hardest hit funding, several hundred million of which flowed to the state of Ohio to help our mission. So it really does open up a whole world of funding. And I think it's that word that we keep coming back to, which is essential. When you've made this transition, to this kind of community and this kind of project, you've changed your brand in effect and opened up this wide world. You'll have cities, counties, states, obviously the federal government, all investing, all trying to find different kinds of funding sources for you. And then as Isaac mentioned, you'll also attract capital from the business community. The Chamber of Commerce is giving us the money to do that Euclid Beach project. So I don't know how specific you want us to get. I mean, it's very obviously funding sources are very place specific. I think to me, the concept is the most important thing here, which is at every level, whether it's philanthropic, lending, permanent financing, any level you want to look at, you're going to, you know, quadruple, quintuple, whatever your funding sources overnight. And then as you learn more and more about them, those 5 new ones will become 10 new ones and 20 new ones.
Mhm.
Yeah,
That's exactly correct, Rich, and very, very important. When you look at across the board, a few of the funders that when I got booted off that I didn't mention, our Rotary Club invested $3.5 million into a trail. Our Kiwanis Club invested $4 million into a club. We received federal dollars. We received state dollars. We received help funders. And when you become a partner in a community partner, a health partner, and an essential organization in your community, even if your health department doesn't have the funding like our health department did, just having them as a partner opens the door to Robert Wood Johnson and other health funders who make grants that can help fund your work. And so it really is building the tent. And I think one of my community leaders said it best one time. He said, Wendy, I always ask how you move a 800-pound gorilla. He said, y'all built a 900-pound gorilla and you brought everybody to the table. And we were able to even launch a corporate partners program where corporations wanted to be a partner with the Freshwater Land Trust, and we would generate $150,000 a year in annual operating support just from them being a corporate partner. And once you had the relationship, you know, in 10 and 15 and $20,000 levels, but then once you had the relationship with them, many of those corporations were providing $100,000, $50,000, $200,000, $1 million or more to various projects that we had on the ground. So it's sort of a snowball effect of layering all these different sources of money, but you have to crawl before you walk.
Thanks, Wendy. And I think we're going to lose Rich here, but George, I think you were about to.
Oh, yeah, if Rich wants to say more, especially we're going to lose him, don't want to.
I just want to say goodbye and thank you, and feel free to reach out to us if you guys need anything. It's been a privilege to be part of it. Thank you.
And I just say, I'm building on, I think the common theme is you build relationships with agencies, you build relationships. It's interesting, banks, there's a Community Reinvestment Act that they have to invest in impoverished communities. You leverage that. Hospitals similarly have to reinvest in health. But the experts are the folks in the agencies and the folks in the community. If you get to know them, you have the conversations. It's amazing what new funding sources they will open for you that you would never have thought of, but they spend every single day in those spaces. So again, relationships, relationships, relationships.
All right, and so we probably only have time to get into this one more. I'm going to try and blend it with a question that came in through the chat. Where do people get started? Let's say you've come from a more traditional lens of conservation work, even perhaps if your work tends to be more rural and more white. But what are some ways that folks following this session can start to think about reaching out to some unconventional partners, thinking about the constituencies that they serve a little differently?
One of the things that we did in Birmingham, and it was so successful that we did it with every initiative that we had, and that is to have a stakeholder process where you are asking the community about their priorities. And you're going to learn some hard truths about your organization. We did this with our strategic plan. We did it with our long-range conservation plan. We did it with a huge park that we put together. We did it with the Red Rock Trail System, which is the product that came out of the health partnership. And it will give, if you do an authentic stakeholder engagement, it opens the door, but you have to build those relationships, but it will also tell you the issues that are the most important for your community, which will allow you to tailor your messaging and your strategy to somebody else's vision. And the other thing that I will say is that once you get some doors open, you have to empower them. We would help not only bring funding into our organization, we would work to get funding into community organizations and partners as well, because you don't have to be everything to everybody. There are a lot of good organizations out there, and sometimes you have the ability to help lift and raise them up, and you need to take those opportunities. I'll hush now.
We'll go around the horn here. Isaac, George, who wants to jump in?
Okay, I'll go. I think that's very good. I mean, you start with your mission. So really you need to figure out as an organization, where are you looking to work? What are you trying to do? And then if you are trying to transition to more urban work, I think what Wendy said there is, it is essential to go into community and to listen and to meet folks where they are. I would recommend oftentimes looking for existing power infrastructure in that community. And at the highest level, that's going to be the local council member or commissioner who represents that community. And go to them and have a conversation, tell them what you do, introduce yourself, say that you think you can bring resources to the table, you'd like to work in that community, and ask for their advice. And there may be other existing infrastructure that exists within there. It could be religious infrastructure. It could be community organization-based infrastructure. It could be something like a PTA, but that elected official probably is going to be a good way to get in the door and start done. That elected official will know who the players are in that community. And that's where I would start, is just once you identify geography, and I'll put another plug that TPL's tools can help you identify the geographies in which you might want to work. Start with elected official, introduce yourself, and ask for some guidance and some introductions for moving forward.
Isaac, what did we miss?
I really like those. Yeah, I think, leading with curiosity, getting out from behind your desk and embedding yourself, through different activities. And as George said, if you go to someone and say, we want to help, these are the resources we can bring to bear, people will generally take you up on that offer. And so being deliberate and finding a good project fit and sort of building those things incrementally to demonstrate your abilities, I think is really critical to demonstrating that you're a solid, authentic partner, and that you sort of are good at bringing others in, and then there will probably be no shortage of work after that.
Well, and we've been talking a lot about means to unlocking financial resources, but we haven't scratched the surface on non-financial resources that can be brought in kind or otherwise contributed, whether it's geospatial mapping, whether it's what have you. So just to help people think expansively about what the full benefit and suite of expanding the tent might entail. All right, Isaac, George, Wendy, Rich and Abstentia, thank you so much for joining us today. A round of applause from all of us at Highstead and the Conservation Finance Network for a really great kickoff. And we did, before we lose folks today, want to talk about part 2 coming in hot on January 11th. Yes, I have that correct. And Tara, I'm going to pass it over to you just to say a word here.
Thank you, Leigh, and thank you to all the panelists and participants for joining us today. Just a quick reminder that part 2 of our Conservation Finance Learning Lab series will be taking place on January 11th at 2 p.m. Where we will be discussing the underutilized sources of funding with Alan Front from the Conservation Pathways and Wade Shelton from the Trust for Public Land. So I hope you'll all be able to join us on January 11th.
And just to say, Spencer Meyer before that next session, we'll be moving on from Highstead, but we really want to thank him for the collegiality and partnership that has led to this series, and formally pass the baton here on from Spencer to Tara and me. So thank you, Spencer. We wish you well. And I will also note that as of this morning, we've also confirmed Allison Souders from the Environmental Protection Agency to join us on January 11th to talk about Clean Water State Revolving Funds, which, if you're paying attention, are slated to double in size in the coming years. Final word,
SRFs.
Spencer?
I'm not sure I want to leave if we're going to talk about SRFs. You know how I feel about those. Thank you, Leigh. It has been so much fun to work closely with you in the network these last several years. And in my new role at NCX, work on carbon offsets and undercredits, I think we'll have a lot to talk about for the conservation finance community. So hopefully we'll still be partnering in other ways. And thanks to you, Leigh and Jackson, Helen, and all of our partners there, and to Tara, who's going to be taking over and doing a lot of this work carrying on for Highstead in the future. So it's been a ton of fun, and I'm great to kick this series off with such inspiring set of case studies. Thanks to everyone for joining us today.
Thanks, folks, and we'll see you in the new year. Cheers. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job, everybody.
Want to unshare the screen, whoever's trolling? There we go. Oh, now we have to.